It's crazy, but I really expected this to be easier. When I released my PvP tier list, some people started asking to see a similar one made for PvE content. And I wasn't sure what to include because, to be honest, you can make pretty much any class work for the majority of the PvE content. It's the PvP where the class differences really shine, and you can separate all the meta classes and the ones that are not in the meta, explain why in detail, what works, what doesn't synergize together. And I think that's why people like the explanation in my PvP tier list, because I dove deep into those differences. For PvE, I wasn't sure really what to discuss. My option was to put everything that is being played and that is being effective in like top tier, and then everything else would go into questionable tier. So like just 2 tiers wouldn't make sense. But then I started thinking about the 2-star dungeons, the 3-star dungeons, the challenge dungeons that get progressively more difficult the higher challenge tier you're pushing. And at that point, the team composition really starts to matter. And that's again where the differences between the classes shine, and some classes really fall off and some shoot to the top. But because we're getting tier 1 or 1-star dungeons during the global release, and we're gonna spend some time on that tier without getting to progress further that quickly, I think we should focus this tier list specifically on tier 1 1-star PVE dungeons. I would like this video to be shorter than my in-depth PvP tier list, which was 55 minutes. So for this one, I will mostly focus on the more meta classes and the classes that work, and the classes that are not that great I will still mention, but I'm probably not gonna go into as much detail as I did in the PvP tier list. So if you want to hear more details about why some of the classes might not work, I would recommend you also check that out. So that was a lot of disclaimers and caveats, and as I said at the beginning, I really expected this to be a little bit easier, but I also didn't want to put everything in S tier and just say, if you have the skill and if you have the brain, you can make everything work. Any weapon combination can be viable, which is kind of true, and that's the beauty of Throne and Liberty. But at the same time, that's not probably why you're here, and you might be interested to hear about the differences between some of the weapon combinations. So with the scope narrowed a little bit to the PVE dungeons specifically, and more focused on tier 1 dungeons because that's what we're getting on global, let's jump straight into this tier list. Alright, where do we even start with this one? I guess we still start with SNS Wand, mostly because it can kind of do 2 roles in one. So it can be a tank and a healer, provided you have enough gear to pull it off. Even in T1, in tier 1 dungeons, when you just start doing them, if you have the weapons equipped but no gear, nothing's traded, you're not prepared, you're probably not going to be able to fully replace a tank and a healer straight away, but the potential is there. With gearing, as it becomes much easier for you to do tier 1 dungeons, you are able to replace both roles, which means you can go in as a tank and as a healer, as an SNS Wand, and then have another 5 people in a 6-man party, another 5 people be full DPS. So this weapon combination is kind of in the tier of its own. I would say it's higher than S tier, to be honest, just because it's pretty much the only combination that can truly replace 2 classes. Any negatives in terms of PvE? Again, it's slower to ramp up. You're gonna be a tank from the beginning. You're gonna have to really gear up to be able to efficiently heal, especially in the harder dungeons. But of course, as you gear up, you just out-level those tier 1 dungeons at some point anyway. So yeah, for tier 1 PvE dungeons, I think this goes to S tier, and it sits there pretty strongly. One thing I do need to mention is that if you're going into a dungeon as a tank and a healer in one role, the SNS Wand, your party needs to know what you guys are doing, which means if there's 5 DPS with you, they need to know how to position at certain stages of the fight so that you don't have to run to heal them at the edge of the arena and turn the boss and potentially mess up the fight. So yeah, very important that your DPSs play with you and support you in this role as a tank and healer in one class. Next, let's talk about SNS Greatsword. I'll put it straight into S tier and let's discuss the fact that it's a tank and it does its tank's duties in the PVE dungeon absolutely amazingly. It can hold aggro, no problem at all. It is relatively easy to gear up, pretty straightforward. And then for the Greatsword, it helps your tanking. If you're picking a tank Greatsword as well, it helps you keep aggro. It has more health. The passives from the Greatsword increase your health and your endurance. So really helpful secondary to your sword and shield for tanking. And then what elevates it straight to S tier is the damage potential of the Greatsword as well. So this might not be the same as SNS Wand, where you're kind of 2 classes in one, but with the SNS Greatsword, at least at the moment, and how you can build the Greatsword part of it with skill expressions and with useful passives, you're kind of 1.5. What I mean is you're a whole tank that can do its role pretty well, or exceptionally well, and then the half is you're also actually a little bit of a DPS. You're not negligible amount of DPS. If you're hitting the boss, you're pulling the aggro and you're doing damage. So SNS Greatsword is absolutely an S tier tank. I cannot put it in front of, well, as a pure tank, sure, it might even go in front of SNS Wand. But because SNS Wand can replace 2 people in the group and allow the other 5 to be DPS, it has to stay at the very top because it's almost breaching into a higher tier than S. But SNS Greatsword is just a strong S tier, so it's gonna stay here for now. Alright, since we're addressing tanks, let's talk about SNS Dagger next. I would put it in the B tier. It's still a good tank. It does anything that a tank needs to do in terms of holding aggro, controlling mobs, controlling the boss very well. But then with the daggers, it just doesn't reach its highest potential. It doesn't output as much DPS as the Greatsword. It's not replacing another role like a healer with the SNS Wand. The daggers really shine in providing you with stealth and evasion passives, and neither stealth nor evasion matter as much in the PVE dungeons, especially when we're talking about tier 1 dungeons. Eventually you're gear up enough and you're out gear a lot of the damage that the dungeon is throwing at you, and so the evasion, it's not going to scale as much. It's not going to provide you as much benefit from the extra evasion from the daggers, and especially the stealth doesn't as well. So while it's still a very strong tank, absolutely nobody's going to turn you down in the dungeon, especially in tier 1. You're just not bringing as much value at the top end as these other meta tank combinations right now with the proper skill expressions. Right, next are some off-meta tanks. I will not go too deep into details here. In terms of the PvP potential, I explain a lot more in terms of why these combinations work or don't work that well in my PvP tier list video, and I talk about how these can be very specific for specific roles in PvP battlefield, like maybe a shot caller or a raid leader that requires the mix of tankiness and range and so on. In terms of PvE, these combinations don't work that great. There are better combinations to choose for a tank, but I'll put them in C tier because if if you are picking these combinations for PvP reasons and you're wondering whether you're going to be able to like fulfill your role as a tank in a PvE dungeon, in a tier 1 PvE dungeon, the answer is yes. You're gonna be able to tank the dungeon, and again, as you gear up, it's gonna become easier, and eventually you're gonna have absolutely no problem being a tank in a dungeon, being a tank in a PvE environment. But in terms of picking these classes specifically for PvE, they're low tier. The only thing preventing them from being in F tier for me is that, again, you can make them work, and they also can be useful in specific PvP situations. So they're C tier for now. All right, let's look at the healers. Super valuable class, always required, especially in PvE. Pretty much any content, you're gonna be in demand. If you're a wand bow, you're like the classic healer. Both the wand and the bow has some healing abilities. The bow also provides utility in terms of crowd controlling the mobs in the dungeon, and it actually can boost DPS of your party if you spec correctly. So wand bow, very effective healer that also buffs your party, goes straight to S tier in terms of its strengths. In terms of its weaknesses, if you build your skills and skill expressions correctly, I can't really, figure out what would be the weakness. You're absolutely effective as a healer, nothing to complain there. You have some supporting damage and group buffs. So yeah, there's pretty much no negatives, just a straight S tier for PvE. One staff is pretty much in the same boat. Very valuable, very sought after as a healer. Wand gives you absolutely enough proficiency to be a main healer in a dungeon. Your staff then again can buff the group in terms of the damage, can output some damage as well, has some defensive capabilities like shield, has cooldown reduction for you. In higher tier dungeons, higher tier content, it has a lot of useful utility, like you can pull your party member to you out of danger. So that becomes very useful. Of course, in tier 1, those differences really don't come out as much because all that competitive type of gameplay is not really required in tier 1. It's more about just heal efficiently and DPS when you can, and one staff can do that really well, so it goes into S tier as well. One dagger is the next one on our list. I kind of struggle to put it into B tier. Let's drop it in C tier and discuss it as a healer in the first place. Yes, wand by itself is usually enough in most situations in tier 1 dungeons to just be a healer, but my question would be, if you're trying to queue one dagger as a healer into a PvE dungeon, tier 1 dungeon, what's the reasoning? If you just started the game and that's the class you're building for, different reasons, PvP reasons perhaps, or just to fulfill some class fantasy that you have, sure. At the beginning, that's fine. But as we progress into the game, even during the tier 1 meta, the question is, why don't you use something else with your wand, like bow or staff, when you're going into the PvE? I would argue that even if you swap to a very low leveled bow or a staff when you're going to do PvE content, you will still be a more effective healer in PvE than a one dagger, because what the dagger gives you is, again, the stealth, the evasion, and it gives you a little bit of crit, which none of that is really required or that necessary for you as a healer in tier 1 dungeons, in tier 1 PvE. And it falls off even more in tier 2, so it's not like you're building for the future as a healer. So I would say, even for tier 1 PvE, beggars cannot be choosers, and if the healer that I have is one dagger, yes, I'll take them to the dungeon, and they will be able to heal me up. But in terms of, is it a high tier, a good healer class? I would say no. It's a few tiers behind one bow or one staff. It's playable, so it definitely doesn't deserve to be an F tier, but I would say as a healer, it's in C tier. And then if we quickly discuss it as a DPS, it has a little bit of bombing potential with the curses and the curse explosion, but for PvE, it really doesn't stack up with the true DPS classes that can just stand there uninterrupted, fire projectiles, or, you know, cleave with the huge hits from the Greatsword. One Dagger really does nothing like that, so even on the DPS list, it would be a little bit lower tier, so I'll keep it in C tier for now. One Crossbow is not a class I would recommend. It's definitely off meta, definitely a lot of cooking required to make it work, so I will not dive too deep into this, as I promised not to extend this video to like 1 hour, but really the synergy doesn't work that well. Crossbow buffs your cooldown reduction and your ranged projectiles. Wand doesn't have that many projectiles, it's insta-cast skills for the most part, so there's nothing really that's being buffed by the Crossbow in terms of the Wand, so as a healer you're really much more effective picking some of these other options, and it's not like you're building this for PvP, because in PvP it's also in a very low tier, so we'll just keep it in F tier for PVE Dungeons as well. And one more build that is left, which uses a wand as well, is Greatsword Wand. Another kind of questionable build for PvE. In terms of PvP, I mentioned that this is a build that is in the oven. Some people are trying to cook. You know, not something I would recommend picking up as a new player, that's for sure. But at least in PvP, you can utilize your mass sleeps from the wand. You can also expect to utilize your mass AoE, mass stuns, and leaps from the Greatsword. None of that is that beneficial for us in PvE, especially in Tier 1 PVE Dungeons. So I would question why you would play this build in PvE specifically, but at the same time, I cannot confidently say that it doesn't work and it deserves an F tier. You know, the wand, especially with the gear, you know, the proper skill specializations, it will be enough to heal up your party. And then Greatsword does bring some damage and does bring some party-wide buffs. So yeah, I don't see why it would not work in specific hands as a PvE build, but it's definitely not pushing higher tiers, so we're gonna keep it in C. Alright, next let's cover the DPS and start with ranged DPS specifically, because they're kind of kings of the DPS when it comes to PvE, especially the combinations of two ranged weapons, because you don't need, you know, the daggers as an offhand, you know, don't need the stealthiness, evasion as much in the dungeons. You get two ranged weapons and you just unleash a barrage of DPS onto the enemies and the boss, and that's exactly what Bow Staff does. Has long-term been a very strong PvE class, as we've went through Tier 1, Tier 2, 3-star dungeons, and challenge dungeons. This is an always in-demand PvE DPS. The bow, the staff synergize well together, buff each other up, and then unleash, you know, like a lot of damage onto the enemy. The bow also has the potential to buff the damage for your group with the deadly marker, apply it onto the enemy, increase the critical hit of your party. Once they land the critical hits, they reduce the cooldown of their skills as well, so you know they can keep hitting faster, they can keep getting those cooldown reductions, and a lot of more DPS is generated in the process just with how much utility the bow can provide. And then the staff, of course, you know, if you're stationary, you're hitting skills non-stop, the staff is really good at that. Hard hitting fire skills or quick hitting ice skills, you know, it has as well some utility for the dungeons when you need to freeze a boss to reduce its damage. In my mind, I'm thinking about 2-star dungeons, of course, but even for PvE Tier 1 dungeons that this tier list is focused on, is an excellent DPS that synergizes great, and it's in a strong S tier for ranged DPS for sure. Another PvE superstar that started emerging recently is the bow Crossbow. Especially after the skill expressions, now that you can tweak and tune some skills and skill effects, suddenly bow Crossbow became very, very strong in PvE. And again, it works based on the deadly marker. that you apply on the boss, you increase everybody's fire rate, basically decreasing their cooldowns as they're critting. It helps you crit as well, so that deadly marker really synergizes with your crossbow too, because you're applying stacks with the crossbow, firing a lot of quick firing projectiles, so you keep just applying and refreshing and applying the deadly marker again. You have the blitz to refresh the deadly marker too, so a lot of the gameplay hinges on that, but then this becomes a strong DPS, strong range DPS for PvE. And in PvE Tier 1 dungeons, it works pretty well as well. We haven't seen its full potential after the skill expressions came out, because at that point everybody was super over-geared for Tier 1 dungeons. But I think we're gonna see this combination perform really well in Tier 1 dungeons, even on global. Of course, be very careful building this and focusing on this build, because it doesn't rank very high in a PvP tier list, so check that out. Check out the what class should I play video to see if you're even gonna like the playstyle of this. But in terms of pure PvE, this is a strong class and it's gonna be in S tier. And then one more class I have to put into S tier for PvE, especially Tier 1 PvE, is of course SNS Dagger. Doesn't rank as high in terms of PvP, but for PvE it's pretty easy to build. It's intuitive. You expect this fast clicking class to be like a boss buster, and that's what it is. You apply your markers from the crossbow and you unload your whole combo that is buffed by your daggers crit, by your daggers maybe thunderstorms, anything you can do to just buff your projectiles from the crossbow and just quickly melt the boss. It's still great. It was always great in Tier 1, and it's still great in terms of PvE, in terms of killing bosses. Very high DPS potential. It's of course high burst, but at the same time you're refreshing your cooldowns, so the burst kind of becomes a sustain as long as you can keep your mana regen. You're bursting the boss all the way through, and it's a very effective weapon combinations for Tier 1 PvE. One thing I do need to mention here is the Crossbow Dagger is of course very gear dependent. You don't have to specifically get like a Bellandir Arc Boss crossbow to reach your full potential. You can be very strong with some good Tier 1 gear on Crossbow Dagger in PvE, but still, in order to ramp up and really dish out your maximum damage, you will need good gear, you will need those set bonuses, and you will need some DPS traits to unlock high potential of the Crossbow Dagger. Alright, next range DPS is going to be our Bow Dagger, a very classic pick, a very popular pick in terms of PvP. In terms of PvE, still a very strong class. Obviously benefits from being ranged in the first place, so you don't have to try and find an optimal spot, always repositioning like maybe some of the melee DPSs. You can be at your max range firing your arrows into the boss. Now with PvE, the daggers don't help as much as they do in PvP. They still improve your crit a little bit, they can boost your damage depending on what daggers you have, but generally just the bow itself, it isn't as strong as the combination of, let's say, bow staff or bow crossbow. In the end, this is just a bow, so it kind of falls one tier below. It's still very strong A tier because besides the damage, it also brings the valuable buffs for the team in the form of deadly marker. You can control mobs with the tornado or flash wave them for a lot of damage to kind of clear mobs as you're going through the dungeon. But in Tier 1 PvE, this is a strong A class, doesn't really reach S for me, but cannot drop down to B tier because it's very consistent, so it's gonna have to stay in A tier. Next one, let's compare it to Staff Dagger, which is another super strong and very popular range DPS class. Again, very popular for its PvP capacities. In terms of PvE though, I would say it can dish out a lot of damage. Based on the skill specialization, it can focus more on the AoE or more on the single target, but it doesn't reach the S tier potential again of something like bow staff, where you get the full potential of the staff with all the DPS and the team support abilities that the bow brings. This is just the staff that is the superstar of the build. The daggers, they kind of again buff your crit damage, but you don't get the value that you get in PvP from the stealth, from the evasion, and in fact you're not as useful to your team in terms of buffing their cooldown reduction, buffing their damage as the bow dagger. So it actually has to go into high B tier, but still B tier, lower than the bow dagger if we're comparing the two, for me at least. Of course, again, we can argue that you can clear any content, especially PVE tier 1 content, as a staff dagger DPS, so don't look at this B tier rating as something bad. It is kind of more middle of the road. It is not pushing as far as the bow dagger at the moment in my mind, so it has to go a little bit lower, but it's a very strong range DPS, and B tier is where it's gonna sit in comparison to something like bow dagger, or especially bow staff and bow crossbow. Another combination is staff crossbow. Not very high in terms of the PvP ranking, but in PvE it works quite well. It has the DPS of the staff, it is buffed up in certain ways by the crossbow. Why this combination works well is really the weekend application of the crossbow. Both the staff and the crossbow fires a lot of quick firing projectiles, and it applies a lot of weekend stacks, which then reduces the cooldowns very effectively, so your burst window extends and it becomes like a sustained burst that keeps refreshing, and you keep getting your skills off cooldown again and again and again. And as long as you can maintain your mana, you can just keep firing a lot of fast projectiles and burning the mobs and burning the boss down. And so that's why this combination can work in PvE. Would I push it all the way to A tier? I would say not. It's not as consistent as something like bow dagger, but I would say it's very player dependent. It has to sit at least in B tier, and a good player that knows what they're doing can probably push it into a higher tier. But just in terms of like, we're preparing for global, a lot of new players are starting to play the game. Would I recommend this build on par with bow dagger? I would say no. We'll keep it in B tier, but just know that it has a lot of potential in PvE. Alright, now that we're done with the range DPS, let's finish it off with the melee DPS, or specifically Greatsword based classes. And the first one is going to be the Greatsword Dagger. Now this could be controversial depending on how you look at it, because Greatsword Dagger is an amazing DPS. It is S tier in certain PvP scenarios. In PvE, I will probably place it in a lower A tier. I definitely cannot place it in front of the bow dagger, but in terms of the PvE tier 1 dungeons, it does bring as much, sometimes maybe even more DPS than the bow dagger itself. Probably somewhere on par. It is very strong DPS. It is a very popular class just because it's being picked for PvP reasons as well. So you're gonna see a lot of Greatsword Daggers, and when they join the party, they're gonna be able to perform on a very high level in PvE, especially in tier 1 dungeons. Now, some people would argue they don't deserve to be on the same tier as bow dagger because how much utility bow dagger can bring to the team with the deadly marker. You know, you apply it, you reduce everybody's cooldowns, you apply it again, you're constantly giving benefits to your party. And I would say that's right, and I could place it in a high B tier as well. But to me, the Greatsword Dagger, especially a good Greatsword Dagger player, can also benefit the team by speccing into the Blood Devotion that increases party's damage, by extending their Da Vinci's buffs, to increase the attack speed of the team. And if you have at least one Greatsword, it's so much utility to the team. Even 2 Greatswords that can cycle their buffs, it's still a lot of utility. So I think Greatsword Dagger is really strong. Definitely, unquestionably, the DPS is there and some team support is there. If you would not accept it in A tier and you would say it's definitely lower than Bow Dagger, I would agree with you, but at the same time, all those differences really pop out, you know, in the next tiers, in 2-star dungeons, 3-star dungeons, challenge dungeons, where you're trying to push those difficult dungeons and where positioning matters a lot more and you have to get back to the boss and out again and back to the boss. That's when the Greatsword Dagger starts to really fall off and the Bow Dagger or just the bow classes really hang in there. But for tier 1 specifically in PvE, what we're gonna have on global for some time, Greatsword Dagger is a very good contender. It is definitely lower A tier, but still A tier for me. All right, again, we've covered the meta classes so far. Let's quickly cover these somewhat off-meta DPS, Greatsword-based DPSs. They can still work in PvE, but I don't want to focus on them too much because they're very rare picks. Even for PvP, they kind of work with a specific build, with a specific intention in mind, but they're not picked that often, and so you won't see them very often in PvE as well. They can all work, but they don't work like the best, so they're definitely not going into S tier. Even in terms of consistency and consistent DPS, they're probably not going into A tier because not everybody can output the same amount of DPS as some of the other classes. Of course, people that know what they're doing, then they can make these builds work. So I could put them in like B tier, but again, we're not gonna dive too deep into them. They're very niche. Specifically the Greatsword Staff, it's more of a PvP build that people try to make work. Again, Staff is a lot of DPS based on heavy attacks. Greatsword is a lot of DPS based on heavy attacks. So we put them together. They work in terms of gearing, in terms of building into heavy attack. They maybe don't work as much because you're close range, far range, close range, you know, with the different weapons here, Greatsword and Staff. But that's not specifically a problem in PvE itself. You can make it work. You can, you know, go into close range when you need to. You can fire projectiles from range with the staff as well. I wouldn't really say it's a problem and the build doesn't work at all. But the aspects that work in PvP specifically, for example, Greatsword, making you super tanky, giving you a lot of HP, and making you hard to kill while you have a lot of AoE stuns. Kind of none of what I just mentioned really benefits the PvE aspect, right? The stuns you can kind of live without. Maybe you have one specific stun for a certain mechanic. You don't need the mass stun. The HP buff, the endurance buff, the survivability buff, also not needed as much as it's beneficial in PvP. So, you know, you can make it work, but you can't really make it as strong as something like a bow staff for a range DPS. So I'll put it in C tier. Again, I expanded into more details than I really wanted to, just because I know that some people want to make this class work and they can make this class work, but like in the overall general environment with the tier 1 dungeons, as the global is coming, I would say this is somewhere in C tier, and then player dependent in terms of trying to push it higher. Greatsword Bow is another class like that, a pretty niche class. Maybe you're trying to make it work for PvP reasons, and then you're joining the PVE dungeon as Greatsword Bow, that's fine. But in terms of it being very powerful and it outperforming certain builds and ranking high, I don't think that's going to be the case. Especially I cannot put it into like very popular and consistent DPS classes like Bow Dagger, Greatsword Dagger. Yeah, you can make it work. Again, you have the bow, you have the Greatsword themselves. They dish out a lot of DPS, but the synergy is not exactly there. Again, one is the melee weapon, another one is ranged. Not all of the passives are interchangeable and buffing each other. Could go into like low B tier, but again, we have very popular classes like Staff Dagger, SNS Dagger here. I would put it in C tier. I would not recommend it to a new player specifically focusing on PvE. to pick this class. There's much better picks you can go with, much more consistent picks for DPS. If you're trying to make it work for other reasons, like PvP reasons, sure, I'm not gonna put it in F tier and completely disregard the build. It can work like a lot of other builds in TNL, but we're gonna put it in C tier, same as Crossbow Dagger as well. This build started to become a lot more popular in PvP with the spin to win. When you leap into the mass amount of people, stun them, spin on them, and try and kill as many as you can before you get killed. I expand more into this in my PvP tier list as well. For PvE, none of that brings as much utility. You're not specifically looking to mass stun somebody in PvE in a tier 1 dungeon and then bomb on them with the crossbow. If you're trying to burst something with a crossbow like a boss, you're gonna get much more burst and potential and much longer consistent burst window with a Crossbow Dagger. If you're looking for some control and heavy hitting melee DPS attacks, you have your Greatsword Dagger. You even have the SNS Greatsword bringing some of that Greatsword DPS. Greatsword Crossbow doesn't work that great. It can, but in general, for again global tier 1 PVE dungeons, we're gonna keep it in C tier as well. And so that wraps up our PvE tier list for the tier 1 dungeons in preparation for global. I think maybe I'm doing some of these classes dirty, like SNS Dagger could be argued into the A tier, but at the same time, I kind of want to show that it is more than just one tier behind something like SNS Greatsword and SNS Wand. Go back to those sections to check why I think that. But yeah, SNS Dagger is going to stay in B tier. A lot of these can be argued in terms of like if I'm talking to a player that has been playing the class for a long time, I can be convinced that Staff Dagger could be A tier in their hands as well. But this should be like a general tier list in my eyes that kind of places each class relative to each other a little bit. And so I hope I provided enough thinking behind all of these placements for you to kind of form your own opinion and pick some bits here and there that are useful for you in terms of deciding what class to play, or just generally thinking which class is more stronger than other in this PvE content. Overall, I hope this provides a solid foundation, at least to spark some discussions, to spark some thinking. And if you found this information useful, give me a like, subscribe to the channel, and check out some of my other videos. If you're trying to pick a class, maybe check out what class to play. And if you're interested in PvP, definitely check out the PvP tier list. I'm getting really excited for global release now, since I'm starting to stream at twitch.tv/crazytrick. Follow me there to catch when I go live. I cannot wait to bring some more useful content to you guys, but for now, Crazy Trick out.